Welcome everyone to the second edition of our Tinkering in Plato's Cave. What we're trying to do here is play around with formats to convey ideas that are not just you listening to me talk, but are a bit more of an immersive experience, even though we all sit at home and we're glued to Zoom. And Marcus, I should say, is sort of a specialist in this. He's been doing this way before, this online performance business before COVID hit us. The idea is basically to have a more almost tactile experience. We can't really provide that, but Marcus is in his VR space, and we want you to be immersed in some way in the sort of problems that we are in today. There's a beautiful article online that I really recommend you look up. We'll provide the link in the chat at some point and in the notes online, which is called Tasting the Pickle. It's by Jonathan Rosen. And he's saying one of the difficult things about tackling complex problems like climate change and things like that is that the problems are too abstract for people to grasp. And so one of our tasks is to make them graspable. So what we want to do with this excursion into VR space is to make some really abstract ideas that underlie the many crises that we have graspable. I would like to start with a little summary of what we've done last time. I hope you all watched the video, but just very briefly, we provided an introduction to the parable of Plato's cave, which is a central myth in Western culture. And we took you into the cave in that video, not you, but the audience we had at that time, of course. And what I would like you to remember from that, or what I would like to point out if you haven't seen that movie, is that a central piece of the parable of the cave is the journey of the philosopher out of the cave into the real world, which is called Anagoge in ancient Greek. And Anagoge is this transformative journey where you complexify yourself, you decenter your focus to be ready to take in the world that you will discover outside the cave. So this is not just applying a scientific method to understand the world. It is a journey where your knowledge of the world is growing through your personal transformations. And we talked about how this outside world of the cave is a world of ideal forms with Plato. That is initially still part of the world we live in. The cave and reality are connected with Plato, but then with his successors, the Neoplatonists, and then St. Augustine especially, it becomes a removed realm, not graspable by rationality. You have to be called into it through your faith. And it becomes the spiritual realm that's completely detached from the physical world. This is called two-world mythology, and it underlies pretty much any effort to make sense of the world between, let's say, 400 BC and more or less the 19th century. But of course, we also talked about this fallacy that Plato commits, that he mistakes an abstraction, the abstract realm of the absolute forms, for reality. Alfred North Whitehead called this the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Your world is kind of upside down. You're missing out on the reality of what's right in front of you, your experience, because you believe in this other world that is more real than the real world. So this is a form of myth making. Plato wanted to replace older myths that involved gods and their struggles and all that. But in reality, he created a new myth, and he created a world. So this is a way in which a philosopher can create a world. There are different kinds of world making. We went through those. You can be a writer, like Borges, magic realism. He creates worlds that are amazingly real, but are not real, right? We talked about philosophical world making already. And also there is this notion in embodied cognition, in the science of embodied cognition, that every one of us interacting with reality creates their own interior subjective world. We bring forth a world. Every living being brings forth its own world. So these are three types of world making, and we're mostly interested in that last meaning of the term, how you bring forth your world. So we concluded last time that today you cannot go into this abstract world of Plato anymore. It's no longer an option. It's not a tenable philosophical idea. Instead, you have to go inside yourself and examine the processes by which you interact with the world. That's what anagoge means. You change yourself, you transform yourself by learning to be a different person. And you do that by training that process that gets you in touch, allows you to get a grip on your reality. And this process involves the subjective and the objective, but it's really a property of the interaction between the two. John Vervaeke calls this a transjective property, something that pertains to you, the subject, interacting with the object. So it's between subject and object. And the distinction between the two becomes resolved in this view. And the process by which we get this grip, he calls relevance realization. You basically pick out what is relevant to you from the potentially endless impressions that you get from the world. This is a process that we can't just step back from and analyze. We cannot make sense of it because we make sense through it. And so you can only explore it by playing with it, by developing different practices, an ecology of practices that allow you to play with that process, to manipulate it, and to experience how it changes. William Irvin Thompson calls this Wissenskunst. Just like Wissenschaft is science in German, Wissenskunst would be the art, it would be theory art, maybe, the art of playing with ideas. This is not just for fun, this is serious play, but it's still playful. So it's not science, it's not art, it's not philosophy, it's Wissenskunst. And that's what we're trying to explore here. With that framing in mind, we want to explore today what happens to Plato's cave in today's environment. And from the title of our performance today, you can already intuit what's going to happen. It's called Undoing Plato's Cave. And to do that, I'm going to use a one-page excerpt from Friedrich Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. It's called How the Real World Finally Became a Fable. Subtitle, The History of an Error. It's sort of the biggest mic drop in philosophy, in the history of philosophy, maybe. So in one page, Nietzsche deconstructs both Plato's ideal world of ideal forms, and the world of experiences, the cave with the shadows. The reason we want to deconstruct this is that I told you we can't go into the ideal world of forms anymore, but we can't just retreat into the cave either. It's very tempting. I mean, this whole cave myth has a big sort of aspect of returning to the womb. It's nice in the cave and warm, and we know what's going on, but we can't do that. So I want to read to you these paragraphs in Nietzsche's text and just muse a bit about them to follow the deconstruction of the cave. The chapter starts like this: the real world, attainable for the wise man, the pious man, the virtuous man. He lives in it, he is it. There's always a parenthesis following. Here it says, most ancient form of the idea, relatively clever, simple, convincing. Paraphrase of the proposition, I, Plato, am the truth. So this clearly is the original setup. The one I said is no longer tenable. It describes Plato, but also Neoplatonism and early Christianity, St. Augustine's view that we have been already talking about. So I'll go right on to the second paragraph, which says, the real world unattainable for now, but promised to the wise man, the pious man, the virtuous man, to the sinner who repents. So you see, it's one step further already. That's what happened during the evolution of the Christian faith. So basically, that ideal world is no longer connected to our everyday world of experience. In parentheses, progress of the idea, it becomes more cunning, more insidious, more incomprehensible. And here you have to excuse Friedrich's political incorrectness. It becomes a woman. It becomes Christian. That tells you a few things about Nietzsche. First of all, he didn't like women and he didn't like Christianity. And it's a terrible sort of language he uses here. But let's try to look past that and think, what is he trying to say? He says something that this idea becomes more manipulative, right? So if Plato just wanted it as an explanation for thinking about the world, a myth to make sense of the world, Christianity sees it as a reward, sort of a carrot dangling in front of your nose, if you obey the laws of Christianity, of course. Paragraph number 3, the real world, unattainable, unprovable, unpromisable, but the mere thought of it, a consolation, an obligation, an imperative. And in parentheses, the old sun in the background, not seen through mist and skepticism. The idea becomes sublime, pale, Nordic, Königsbergian. Of course, it was Immanuel Kant who was in Königsberg. And what he means here is the world of noumena, das Ding an sich, that Kant was postulating. Kant was a transcendental idealist. He saw the world of phenomena, of experience, as disconnected from the world of the things as they really are. That's what Ding an sich means. And that world is completely inaccessible to us. We're trapped through our a priori concepts of space and time and causality in this world of appearances. But it's still a consolation, even for the idealist, that there is a world somewhere that is real. So you can see a sort of an attenuation, a dilution of this idea of Plato's world, right? So let's go to paragraph number 4. Now stuff gets really serious. The real world, unattainable, at any rate, unattained. And since unattained, also unknown. Hence, no consolation, redemption, obligation either. What could something unknown oblige us to do? Parentheses, break of day, first yawn of reason, cockcrow of positivism. What is he talking about here? He's talking about the philosophy of positivism that comes after Kant, of course. It was pioneered by French philosopher Auguste Comte, who subdivided human intellectual development into 3 principal stages. The first one is the theological, Christianity. The second is metaphysical, Kant. And the last one is positive, where you drop all the metaphysical bullshit and you focus on what's real. This is what Nietzsche means by the unattainable world. It's been completely disconnected from the real world. So metaphysics is just declared illegal. Either you can prove something empirically, or it doesn't make any sense. It's meaningless. Only what can be experienced is real. But doesn't that mean in the end that only appearances are real? Are those appearances only apparent, or are they real? What people don't know about positivism, which is usually seen as a sort of hardcore scientific view of the world, is that it's anti-realist. It says we cannot connect to the reality that's out there. And in that way, it's very similar, actually, to postmodern philosophy. Carnap, the positivist, is similar to Rorty, the postmodernist, in that they say everything is wrapped up in language. Everything, the postmodernist would say, is discourse. We get to paragraph number 5. The real world, an idea with no further use, no longer even an obligation. An idea become useless, superfluous. Therefore, a refuted idea. Let us do away with it. Parenthesis, broad daylight, breakfast, return of bon sens and cheerfulness, Plato's shameful blush. Din from all free spirits. It's very dramatic. We freed ourselves from religion. God is dead. Daylight, breakfast. You can see the sun rising in some Wagnerian tune in the background. Cheerfulness, it's a good thing. And Plato's shame. It's not very nice. It's the beginning of the end of Plato's world. But it's at the same time a disenchantment of our reality. There are no ideals anymore. But the free spirits cheer. What do they cheer on? Where does this lead? It leads to paragraph number 6, which reads, the real world, we have done away with it. What world was left? The apparent one, perhaps. But no, with the real world, we have also done away with the apparent one. This is really mysterious. We'll parse it in a second. But he has a parenthesis as usual. Noon, moment of the shortest shadow, end of the longest error, pinnacle of humanity. Wow. Insipid Zarathustra. It's a little self-citation here to his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Zarathustra is the prophet of the Übermensch. That's a very often misinterpreted concept. It's what comes after us, a better human being, the next evolutionary step, right? So we take fate in our own hands. But how can we do this if both Plato's ideal world and the real world have disappeared? We have done away with the apparent one as well. What does he mean? Nietzsche is often mistaken as a nihilist. But that was actually what he was talking against, right? So he doesn't say the real world, the world of experience, the world of ideals, everything is gone. Nothing makes any sense anymore. He warns us from that, but he doesn't advertise it as any sort of way forward. Everything would be void and null. So he's often wrongly accused of being negative, but what he wants to say is we have to find a way forward. How do we go forward from here? We've deconstructed not only the world of ideals, but also the cave. Not much is left, only floating rocks in space here. If it's not nihilism, is it solipsism? Everything just revolves around you and your sensations. Nothing else is real. Are we trapped inside our heads? Neither here nor there. Are we dislocated, out of joint? Are we living in a simulation? A disembodied brain in a vat? It's very fashionable nowadays to talk about the simulation hypothesis. The simulacrum is never that which conceals the truth. It is the truth which conceals that there is none. The simulacrum is true, writes Jean Baudrillard in his Simulation and Simulacra. This book is what's behind the movie The Matrix. It talks about this world that we've trapped ourselves in. Hyper reality, more real than real. And it's very important today. Why is this idea of simulation, that we live in a simulation, why is it so popular? Is it because that's what we're actually doing in real life? We're attracting into this virtual world. You can see the sky suddenly has changed from black to white or gray. We're in a fog. Nothing makes any sense anymore. So isn't it easy to say, okay, this is all just appearances? But the simulation hypothesis, of course, is nothing but Christianity recycled. There is a better realm waiting for us outside the simulation. And who's outside the simulation? Some sort of godlike creature that is running the simulation. So what Elon Musk, David Chalmers, and others are telling you, and they tell you this, it's a dangerous kind of relativism. It's like the Lord in the Middle Ages promising the peasants a better life, after they die. It's a terrible, terrible view of the world that takes away all your agency. This is what relativism does. This is the core of the problem with postmodernism. It deconstructs everything. We have destroyed the cave. You can see there's very little left. How can we move forward? How can we make sense? So is Nietzsche telling us there is no truth? We're in some kind of zombie land. I talked last time about this ultimate modern myth of the zombie, the meaninglessness, the breakdown of communication. Zombies eat brains, literally destroying sense. They don't talk to each other. They have no aim. All they do is eat and walk around aimlessly. They're not even evil. They just have no meaning in their life at all. But this is not what Nietzsche says. Nietzsche has a solution. Nietzsche tells us how to rebuild the world, how to reconnect, how to re-enchant this heap of rubble that you see. This empty void, the fog, the rubble, it symbolizes the meaning crisis that we're in. Yet a crisis is always an opportunity. All this empty space, it is liberating. We may be in a liminal no man's land, but in this empty landscape, any intervention, however small, can leave a visible footprint. We have arrived at a turning point in history, a kairos, which is characterized by maximum crisis, but also maximum agency, opportunity. It is pregnant with potential, and we cannot miss it. But the question remains, where do we go? We have deconstructed everything. How do you feel in this void? How would you visualize the situation? How do you go ahead from here? And let me tell you one thing, we won't let you rebuild the cave. So what I want to do now is I want to engage you in a discussion. What do you feel about this deconstruction? How does it leave you? Hopefully not hopeless. And do you have any idea? Could you tell Marcus what he should do to reintroduce meaning into this foggy, empty void. Does anyone have any idea? Any suggestion? Marcus has built this pile of rubble. It's very unstable. Yes, Pascal.
I guess the most basic thing would be to start building one's own things, or to, with the pile of rubbles, kind of bringing the different pieces together as he is just doing it.
He's building, right? But look at what he built. I think it's ugly. It's and look it's sort of, it's unstable. It's, yeah, we have to rearrange the pieces that we have left, right? It would be foolish to throw anything away. These are tools that we could maybe use. But how to rearrange them? What will guide us? There's nothing to guide us here. There's no shape or form. There's no more myth, right? The myth had these well-defined shapes. The cave, it was very comfy. You know, the way out, it was very liberating. The beautiful landscape that Marcus had drawn outside with the town and the people, everything is gone. Everything is hopeless. Everything is just gray fog. So how can we rebuild that? Is there anything left? We have to go within us. That much was clear from last time already. What is left of us in this landscape? Anyone? All right, Victoria has put a question in the chat. And yes, you have a few minutes to reflect. Don't worry. Should I read your question, Victoria? I'll read it. Trying to build something new, don't we risk to go back to the previous scenario? Because it is the only meaningful way we know. That's true. I mean, it's really hard to build something new, and you just have to sort of get a feeling of how momentous this is. It's a very good question. I mean, I think.
Because can you listen to me?
Yes, I hear you.
Because looking at what Marcus is doing, we get a bit unquiet because doesn't look like a proper structure where you can, for example, live inside, has something. So we are directly, how can I say? As soon as you start buying the rocks again, my intuition was to make some kind of cave again.
Yes.
And so
it's very tempting.
I don't know what else I could build with this if not a cave. Like I can do like a bridge, a pie or whatever. But at some point, if I was a person, I would need a place of a comfort zone, a safe place. And the first thing that comes to my mind, it's going back to the cave.
That's great. Thank you. So we need a place of comfort to start from. That is a great point. So let's keep that in mind. Let's pin that. Hilda put something in the, I see Paul's hands up. I'm just going to read a few of the comments that Hilda put in the chat. One needs to define what the guides could be, the principles we could use before we start building, and adapt the guides if needed while building. We cannot imagine the final stage before we start building. Bridge, cave. That's very good. So step by step, very pragmatic and adaptive. Okay, we have to go in small steps. The Taoist approach. If you want to climb a mountain, you have to take a first step. But even for that first step, we need a guide, right? Where do we find that? We have to find it out of a place of comfort, as Victoria says, but how to create a place of comfort in a foggy zone like this? Paul.
I like what Hilda said. I think combining that with comfortable place or a safe place that we find within us, we can attempt to figure out kind of recreating forms and patterns that we find within ourselves that kind of naturally emerge. And I don't see them naturally now, or they don't come easily to me in those stones that we have here before us, but maybe there are new elements that could be introduced. And I think the possibility space of things that can be built in this foggy zone are potentially endless. And then we have to bridge that, or that is at least how I view this, with patterns that we also see not just within us, but that we also see on the outside. And those helping us bridge kind of the gap that you alluded to earlier on, from the merely subjective and deconstructed sphere of only our personal preferences towards the objective shared reality that is
I've lost you. Does anybody else have problems hearing him? Now you're back. Paul?
Oh, sorry, was I lost?
Yes, so you were just
At
saying,
which point?
you were just saying we need, not just to go within, but also to look at our interactions, right? And then you cut out.
Oh, yes, and kind of combine that what comes from within with the natural patterns and the patterns and things that we find ourselves surrounded with, thus creating something like the transjective that you talked about earlier, something that connects the deconstructed subjective sphere with the external objective sphere.
So we have to examine our interactions with each other, with the physical world, and see where they come from. Yeah. So there was a lot to unpack there, and a lot of really good stuff. So the only way, we can't go back to the cave, right? So the only way is to go further inside to make sense of those shapes that are left. The potential is huge, but as Hilde said, we need guides. So where can we get any guidance in this void, in this fog, in this meaninglessness? I think it's very tricky. So there are infinite ways of interacting with each other. What are good ways of interacting with each other? What are, social systems? This is one of the biggest problems we have right now. The meaning crisis leads to this societal crisis, political crises that we have. Different systems of thinking are fighting against each other quite literally these days. How can we build a world where all of these stop fighting, but where we sort of acknowledge that different people want different ways of rebuilding? Albin put in the chat a Pete Mondrian quote. It seems to me that the clarity of thought should be accompanied by a clarity of technique. That's great. So if you don't have good tools, you can't do any straight thinking. So thought has to lead to action, right?
I'm probably thinking very pragmatic about this, if I may.
Absolutely.
So I think it's about defining. So I see Marcus drawing, right? And you go like, okay, if I want to build something, what matters for me when I start building, which was exactly what I meant with the guides. For me, it would need to be something stable. So what is the practical thing that could provide stability? Probably some heavy blocks on the bottom. So it's about defining what matters, like stability would be something. Of course, these things might not be the same for everyone, but maybe there are some common ones or some principles that are, that people can agree on. But as I said, this might be just very pragmatic.
So a big pyramid rather than this thing.
No, again, I said you cannot visualize the final thing. That would be wrong.
Okay, yeah.
But you can say what matters. What matters is stability. What matters is maybe for some people that you can easily change the shape or not.
But that seems to contradict each other, how would you build something stable that is easily changeable?
It depends, changeable by which forces. Changeable, I don't mean by falling over. So stable, like, okay, it shouldn't immediately fall, but it should be adaptable. Maybe adaptable is a better word.
So let's think of this yellow goo that is there. Marcus, it's gone dark. I think the iPad's gone dark. This is, you can imagine this as goo, the yellow stuff that sort of props the tower up. It's still, now it's better. That still stabilizes the whole construction, but it can sort of change its shape, right? Change its form. And Marcus is building some trusses. It still looks a little improvised to me, right? So I just want you to sort of get a feeling of that. It's obviously very metaphorical what we're doing here. It's not a work of philosophy what Marcus is doing. He's doing the arts part. So this is intentional. So feel free to be very sort of metaphorical, because you just want to sort of talk about how you feel. What is the feeling of that, way forward?
I think should be a situation that change our point of view. So then we don't end up building exactly the same cave, but we are able to recognize, that cave was not that great. It needed some changes. It needed some refinement. It needs some details that the previous one didn't have. So then we go to a next step. If we don't learn anything from the destruction of the cave, we are going to end up building the same cave in the same way, and we are not learning anything from that.
I think that's a really good point. So we have all these degrees of freedom, but we're still very liable to just rebuild, to make the old mistakes again, right? So how can we avoid that? How can we be really, really radical? How can you think outside the box if the box is no longer there, right? So Hilde writes, one needs to decide on the characteristics of the shape first and on what keeps the blocks together. What would be the glue? How strong would the glue need to be? That is a good question. So for us in this VR world, it's very simple, right? You can just stick objects together in any way you want. And there's no gravity either. But what we want to do here, and maybe it's time to sort of move into that last part of the performance. What we want to do here is we want to do something more radical than just rebuilding the pile of tools. It would be foolish to throw them away, right? But what you got out of this discussion is that it's really hard to think of new designs. You can get a feeling of how powerful that myth is that Plato gave us. We want to go back. It has this visceral feeling of comfort, and it was a world that we knew, and that made sense, right? So how can you avoid this false security? It's very difficult to think in new forms unless you think the whole thing really radically and move away your attention from the rubble to the shadows that Marcus is pointing to. the shadows are still here. Our shadows will remain. That's a very good album by Joseph Arthur, by the way. We cannot get rid of them. We carry them with us. Shadows are something very, very interesting. Shadows can make us think about the whole nature of space instead of looking at the pile of rubble that's laying around. We can think about the shadows as an inversion of light, of space. Shadows are what is not. At the same time, the shadows are always with us, wherever we go. And this is why we kept those shadows in the landscape. They are our only way forward. But they are weird, okay? So they require us to really, really rethink the most fundamental thoughts we have about the world. We need to improvise. We need to let go of all the tools for a moment that we had left in the pile of rubble. We have to jury-rig a new solution. These shadows that we cast are also a fundamental part of our interaction with the world, right? The shadow is not a part of you. The shadow is cast by you into the world. It's something physical. You wouldn't say it is something that is part of your body, but it's also something that's very subjective at the same time. In that sense, it's like the zombie. It's neither alive or dead. It's neither here nor there. It's neither subjective or objective. So in a sense, maybe the radical move that we should do, and the only way in which we can rescue the metaphor of Plato's parable, is to turn the journey of Anagoge completely inside out. We're not going out of the cave anymore, but the cave is no longer there. The only way we can go is inside the shadows. Okay? This may sound a little weird because you, of course, but you can move inside a physical shadow. We have that when there is a solar eclipse. We're in the shadow and we feel that the shadow is real, but the shadow isn't anything. I just discovered that there's a whole philosophy book about shadows. I haven't read it yet, but I'll report to you what I find in there. So this is what we would call an inverse anagoge. And it's sort of not just going, when we say you have to go inside, we don't mean that you just, I will not channel Yuval Harari and just say you have to go and meditate and everything will be fine. But you have to go and look inside to that process by which you make meaning. Okay, and also how your interactions with other people and with your environment, the physical world, shapes that meaning making. And the great thing about Nietzsche is that he provides a starting point for that journey. Nietzsche is the first philosopher to propose perspectivism as a solution to our problems. What is that? What is perspectivism? In his very dramatic way, as usual, in the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche writes that he complains, he likes to complain. He complains about all the other philosophers, and he says, dogmatic philosophers have one big flaw. They don't see their own limitations. All the systems of philosophy that we have had so far are just memoirs, philosophical memoirs, he says, an individual view of the world. Like fish in water, these philosophers didn't see the medium they were swimming in. They didn't see where they ended, what their limitations were. So the thing about perspectives is they're not just arbitrary points of view, not just opinions. The thing that Nietzsche brings into the discussion is that perspectives contribute to what meaning making is. In fact, they're your only way forward. As knowers, we should appreciate the fact that we can actively choose our perspective. That means you can choose your framing, and only by changing your framing can you see things differently. There is no other way. And this is literally what anagoge means, a change of frame. Nietzsche writes, this is no small discipline and preparation for the intellect for its future objectivity, in parentheses, scare quotes, which is not disinterested contemplation. That's a non-object and an absurdity, but rather it is the capacity to have one's pros and contra in one's own power and to shift them in and out so that one knows how to make precisely the difference in perspectives and effective interpretations useful for knowledge. So we have to compare how we feel and think about things. And that's the only way. That's not a problem. In fact, that's the only way to gain knowledge. And the more perspectives we have, the more perspectives we master to understand, the more objective our knowledge gets. There is no view from nowhere, no God's eye view. Objectivity can never penetrate beyond subjective appearances. This is why the world of appearances is also gone. Instead, we can approach objectivity by exploiting the differences between us, between different approaches, between different cultures, each overcoming the limitations of the other. So if you think back to Kant, he claims that the basic features of the world, time, space, causality, are a priori. They're in our heads. They are necessary for our thinking. We cannot think without them, but they're still subjective in our heads. But for Nietzsche, these are based on our empirical psychology. I like to talk about David Hume. He analyzed causality, and unlike Kant, he wasn't convinced that causality was real. He was sitting in his armchair, looking at things happening, one thing after the other, and he said, you can never tell whether one thing causes another thing. Causation is just habit. A usually is followed by B. That's all there is. And we can never talk about causes because we can never know them. But obviously, Hume never got out of his armchair and bumped his toe on the door jamb. There you have causality. It hurts. You can have this problem that Hume has only if you keep sitting in the chair and do nothing and just watch passively. But exploration is an action. It requires agency. Every perspective is rooted in affect, emotions, and patterns of valuation. That's what Nietzsche tells us. Every great philosophy, so far as every personal confession, so far has been a personal confession of its author. So he says we have to take this serious, but he doesn't end up with a nihilistic relativism at all. Because he said we can evaluate perspectives, not only from the point of truth, but also in terms of the point of new framing, of the framing in which the truth makes sense, and also in terms of how they feel in this moment. So he's not saying any opinion is just as good as any other. He's saying there are things that are good. You feel that in this situation. It's not arbitrary at all. That's how we get not only a genealogy of morals, but that's how we can evolve knowledge. So to summarize, this is not a denial of truth. Nietzsche often stresses the truth of his own views and values. He talks about truthfulness and honesty. You can't be honest if there's no truth. Reality itself is a system of ever-shifting force centers, which themselves continue a variety of points of view on the whole. So Nietzsche gives us a toolkit that gets us out of the problem of meaninglessness. And that is to take ourselves serious, take our own processes serious, take others' processes serious, and then try to compare those processes and learn from that. So if we reread the last paragraph, not the parentheses, just the part where he says, the real world, we have done away with it. What world was left? The apparent one, perhaps. But no, with the real world, we have also done away with the apparent one. What he's saying is not that everything is gone. He says, no, we have a new foundation. The only thing that's real is that experience that connects those two worlds. The world of your experience is not apparent, it is the real world. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to use Alexis von Plön's theory of shadows to search for space beyond the shadow. These shadows give us different shapes and hooks to enter different aspects of what it means to explore that interaction between us and the world, to play around with that process of relevance realization. We don't know what will expect us in the shadows. They are dark, they're the absence of anything. But they are also the inversion of those concepts of space, of those tools that we had in the cave that came down with the rubble. We connect to the world through picking out those differences that make a difference. This is how we can recreate and re-enchant the world.